Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Whisky Wednesdays. My name's Daryl Lim, and I'm your host. This week is the last in our Shelter Point series featuring the 5 whiskeys that I came back from Shelter Point with. Tonight we're going to do a live tasting each one of these 5, and do let me know in the comments below which one is your favorite if you've had the opportunity to taste them. So tonight, starting from my left, at the far left here, we've got the single Cask Peat whiskey, followed by the Smoke Point whiskey, the Artisanal single malt whiskey, their bestseller, the double barrel, and last but not least, the Forbidden. Shelter Point does have quite a lineup of whiskeys, and if you haven't had a chance, don't forget to catch the last 3 episodes where we showcased the distillery with an on-site tour of their facilities, including their visitor guest experience center, along with warehouse number 1 and warehouse number 2. And for those of you who did watch, you will remember us tasting for the first time ever a whiskey that has been matured for less than 3 months in a 10-year-old ex-Artbeck cask. So that was one of the highlights of my visit there. And want to thank you again to Mark Kaczynski from the Barhaven Whiskey Brotherhood, who now resides there on Vancouver Island, for inviting me and setting up the tour, along with the owner of Shelter Point Distillery, Patrick Evans, and the man himself, Jacob Weep, manager of the distillery, who very patiently answered all the questions and took both Mark and I around the distillery a couple of months back. So for our first whiskey tasting this evening, we're going to be tasting the single Cask Peat from Shelter Point. This is one of my favorite whiskeys from this distillery. It is nicely peated and has a very round flavor to it. I actually first tasted it, I mentioned that before in a prior video, about a year ago when Jacob did a virtual whiskey tasting for our whiskey group here in Ottawa. And immediately fell in love with that and ordered one from them. And this is a 57.2% ABV, and typical size and look for all of the Shelter Point whiskeys. This particular one here is a no chill filtration, bottle 113 of 138. Now for the description on here, it is so this single peat whiskey was a one-of-a-kind containing single grain barley and malted wheat, matured for 5 years in ex-bourbon American oak before an 18-month finishing in a Lafroig quarter cask. And that's where the peatiness and the taste of the peat comes out from that Lafroig maturation process. So let's give it a taste. You can see a beautiful honey brown color. If you can see it through the light, there is a texture. It's not quite clear to it, but has an oiliness to it. And by the way, these are cute little Glencairn tasting glasses compared to the regular size Shelter Point ones. And I love them so much I came back with a pair of the small ones and a pair of the regular size ones. So 4 areas that we're going to cover. We're going to leave the pairing out tonight. What we're going to do is we're going to be tasting the 4 areas and covering the 4 areas: color, nose, palate, and finish. So let's start with the color. Well, we've done the color, and let's go ahead and do the nose. That's bold richness that comes out. Very flavorful indeed. And we'll do the first taste. There's a nice sweetness that comes from this peated whiskey. The peat isn't strong, but you can taste that smoky flavor on your palate right away. I really like that nice, it's almost like a honey taste to it. It's one of the few peated whiskeys that I'd say has more of a sweetness to it. You can also taste that oily texture as it coats your palate. Very nice. For those of you who are not sure about peated whiskeys, this is, I would say, a gentle peat. It's got a medium finish. And the burn is not, it's not a heavy burn to it. So a very nice whiskey. I'm generally more a guy who likes heavy peat. However, this was had the peat flavor, and yet it had the sweetness to it. So a very nice balanced whiskey that way. And for our second whiskey tasting this evening, we're going to be tasting the Smoke Point whiskey from Shelter Point. Now, it was about a week and a half ago that a friend of mine, I was on the way to a private whiskey tasting right here in Ottawa with a few of my whiskey brethren, and one of them brought along a medicine bottle sample of the Smoke Point whiskey, and for the first time I tasted it, and it was mesmerizing. It had a very complex yet rich flavor to it. It had the smoke, and yet it had a very interesting boldness, and all around was beautiful. It paired very well that evening with a Monte Cristo cigar. I knew that I had a bottle that was already ordered and en route, so that was almost like an initial tasting that I had. So when this bottle finally arrived late last week, I was quite excited and couldn't wait to open it and showcase it right here on this video. This here is a 53% ABV alcohol volume. It is part of the batch 3 of Shelter Point's first ever peat influenced whiskey. The description on the bottle is the sweet and smoky treat has been aged in American oak ex-bourbon barrels for 5 years before a 2-year finish in special quarter casks previously used by a famous distillery on the Isle of Islay in Scotland. Utilizing both malted and farm-grown unmalted barley, the whiskey takes on sweet vanilla notes from the American oak and wonderful peaty phenolic undertones from the ex-Islay casks. Rich, smoky, and complex, Smoke Point remains Shelter Point's quintessential fireside dram. And like I said, the single cask peat, if you put that next to the Smoke Point whiskey, they both have very similar color profiles. I'm going to hold them up both side by side. This here is the single cask peat that we just tasted, and this here is your Smoke Point whiskey. If you put them up to the light side by side, you'll notice that they both have very similar color tones, and they both have that rather semi-opaque, oily texture to it. So let's go ahead and do that 4 points. So we just talked about the color. Let's go ahead and do the nosing. When I'm doing a whiskey tasting, I always enjoy having 2 glasses side by side so we can kind of compare the nosing. So right now we're nosing the Smoke Point whiskey. And let's compare that to the single cask peat. So right off the bat, they both have that peatiness, smokiness to it. But one thing is unique is I smell that floral, almost like a floral a smell within the Smoke Point. The great thing about whiskey tasting is to be able to smell it, put that away, give it a few sniffs of fresh air, and then come back and sniff it again and again. The other thing you'll always notice is that I do leave a little bit of a dram remaining because I like to come back to the whiskey tasting at the end so I can then compare 1 through 5. And the other thing that is interesting about whiskey tasting and whiskey appreciation is that once let's say you've finished the dram and there's no more liquid left in the glass, it's actually good to keep the glass around so you can sniff the glass at the end because the flavor profile and certainly the smell the nosing profile could potentially change once the spirits have all been consumed. And the other thing I like to notice is to leave the dram sitting out for about half an hour prior to a tasting, because again, the mixture with the air and the elements does affect the whiskey profile. I do like that, like I said, that I detect that floral smell to it, but I can definitely also notice the smokiness, hence smoke point. Wow. That burn, that slight spiciness, that burn is very noticeable. It's not a heavy whiskey compared to the peat whiskey that we just tasted. This one actually is, I'd say, a touch bolder on its first taste. As I'm holding that dram on my palate for that second longer tasting, I can definitely feel the spiciness dance off my tongue. I can also taste the oily texture that's coating my palate. So very similar again to the single cask peat. I have both the oily texture there along with the bite from the spice on the smoke point whiskey is definitely more pronounced compared to the single cask peat. Very flavorful indeed. And I may have to take back what I just said earlier on and call this my new favorite whiskey compared to the single cask peat. I taste almost a nuttiness to it on the finish. I would definitely put this in the medium towards the bold finish. And the finish keeps a very nice nutty flavor on your palate as an aftertaste. The sweetness profile is actually less than the single cask peat on the flavor, even though the nose, I picked up a bit more of that floral scent compared to the single cask peat. The flavor was completely less sweet compared to the single cask peat. So there you have it. That's your smoke point whiskey. I probably give this a run for its money in terms of calling it my new favorite whiskey from Shelter Point. And our third whiskey this evening is the Artisanal Single Malt Whiskey. This is Shelter Point's bestseller to date, and at 46% ABV, it is both a flavorful whiskey that it makes for a great sipper, summer or winter sipper. And we're going to have an opportunity to taste and compare that tonight. I've tasted this quite a number of times, the first being that virtual whiskey tasting that Jacob had hosted over a year ago, and more recently on Vancouver Island itself at both Shelter Point, along with a few of my guests when I was staying with them on Vancouver Island. One of the hallmarks of Shelter Point Distillery that was highlighted in the previous video, and what makes them so special, is that their whiskey process, and they make whiskeys from single grain barley that's grown on site on their property. At least 70% of the barley that is used in the Shelter Point process is grown right on site on their property, and only about 30% remaining is imported from other farming communities around British Columbia. And their other secret ingredient that makes Shelter Point so special, in my opinion, is 1 billion liters of fresh, natural spring water that flows from Mount Washington through the Oyster River and right through to an aquifer under their property. And with that fresh spring water that you can definitely taste in each of their whiskeys, along with their homegrown barley, that's what makes Shelter Point Distillery, in my opinion, not just a distillery, but a farm that grows its own barley and its own wheat alongside having its own natural spring water source. So this is the third tasting of the Artisanal single malt. You can tell the color, it has a much clearer color to it. I'd say more on the honey brown side, but on the lighter shade of that honey. More on the golden, light golden, compared to the first two. In terms of the oiliness to it, it is probably less oily than the single cask and the smoke point. In terms of the nose, I can smell that caramel. There's a sweet caramel to it flavor. Probably a little bit of honey, if you will, but for me, definitely more on the caramel. Vanilla and caramel. Perhaps I'd say smoked vanilla. There's a little bit of smokiness to it, not by much compared to the first two whiskeys, but that caramel really jumps out at me. Now, the floral scent on your nose is very appealing for a 46% whiskey. Let's give it a taste. This is what I call a beautiful whiskey with an explosion of light floral tasting notes to it. I love it. I know now why this is the top selling whiskey for Shelter Point. It's very easy to drink. It has a light sweetness to it, yet there's no smokiness and no peatiness to it. For those of you who are whiskey amateurs, if you're new to whiskey, then I'd say this would make for a great starter whiskey and a great sipping whiskey for you. You'll notice sometimes I like to chew on my whiskey, let it run through my teeth a few times back and forth, kind of pushing that whiskey through my teeth. When I do that, I'm almost trying to taste the texture and see if it's oily, does it leave residue on my teeth or my gums, or is it meaty in flavor? I like to compare some whiskeys that are very wholesome and meaty to almost drinking a Guinness stout. But no, this whiskey here, compared to the first two whiskeys that were perhaps a touch oilier, I find this to be relatively clear, and the flavor profile very well matches that. I would consider this whiskey having a light to medium finish. There's no boldness that sits the way the Smoke Point or the single Cask Peat sit. And again, perhaps a light touch of spiciness to it, but overall, a medium light whiskey. I strongly encourage this to anyone who is new to whiskeys, and this is a great introductory one. We've come to the end of this week's whiskey tasting review. Don't forget to like and share this video with your friends and fellow whiskey lovers. Let me want to give a shout out at this point again to Shelter Point Distillery. Do check out their website at the link right below. Here's one interesting thing. When you order a whiskey from Shelter Point, they give you one of these flavor wheels. And this flavor wheel helps you to identify all the different flavors available when you're tasting your whiskeys. So it's a great guide to have with you if you're an amateur or new to the whole whiskey tasting and experience process. We have come to the end of another episode of Whisky Wednesdays. I want to take this opportunity to wish all of my Canadian fans and subscribers a happy Thanksgiving weekend. Drink responsibly and do enjoy a dram or two. Sláinte.